Welcome to our first lesson on the character of Mrs Birling. We will be exploring 3 of her characteristics in this module, starting with her aloofness. To begin, we will analyse her repeated contempt for the lower class, and her reliance on etiquette and decorum to present herself as distant and unfeeling. Finally, we will look at how she continually manoeuvres social situations to maintain a calm facade and one of superiority. We will also analyse her repeated contempt for the lower class and deliberate use of social rules to elevate herself above others. Let's begin. Mrs Birling's contempt for the lower class is repeated throughout the play, exposing her lack of empathy. In Act 2, when discussing Eva's death with her daughter, she states,
"Please don't contradict me like that. And in any case, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class."
Mrs Birling's use of the plural pronoun we, in contrast to girls of that class, deliberately attempts to create a divide in order to justify her apathy and disconnection from responsibility. This divide shows that she fundamentally sees herself and her family as superior to people of Eva Smith's social standing. Mrs Birling's lack of emotion is jarringly evident in her dismissive phrase, "in any case," which presents her apathy to Eva's death. Furthermore, her indignation is more pronounced when she says, "Please don't contradict me like that," showing that she is more concerned about maintaining her authority than empathizing with a dead girl. Thus, Mrs Birling is shown to be aloof and apathetic to the suffering of the lower class due to the deliberate divides she manufactures. Furthermore, in Act 2, when discussing Eva's death with Sheila and the inspector, Mrs Birling deliberately uses the rules of social etiquette to present herself as superior and above others. For example, when the inspector agrees with Sheila's remark that the inspector will be able to break down any walls built between them and Eva, Mrs Birling says to the inspector,
"That, I consider, is a trifle impertinent, Inspector."
The adjective impertinent means to not show proper respect. By using this word, Mrs Birling is making it clear that she feels disrespected by the inspector, and she prioritizes herself above him. This interaction shows that Mrs Birling thinks she is more important than the inspector. Additionally, her focus on her own feelings rather than seeking justice for Eva Smith demonstrates her aloofness and lack of empathy. This attitude highlights how Mrs Birling's sense of superiority affects her interactions and decisions, making her appear distant and uncaring. The original meaning of impertinent is irrelevant, and this meaning is operative here because Mrs Birling is insisting on the irrelevance of Eva's death to her, her family, and her class. Finally, Mrs Birling's determined lack of emotions starkly contrasts with the tension felt by the other characters, revealing her reactions as inauthentic. For example, in Act 2, when discussing the inspector's impending interrogation about Eva's death, Mrs Birling says, after a pause, recovering herself,
"If necessary, I shall be glad to answer any questions the inspector wishes to ask me, though naturally, I don't know anything about this girl."
This quote exposes Mrs Birling's emotions as manufactured and heavily monitored. The stage direction, after a pause recovering herself, shows that Mrs Birling's calm demeanour is deliberate and controlled rather than genuine. Her use of the demonstrative pronoun this when referring to Eva Smith further diminishes any possible emotions she might feel, making her appear detached and unfeeling. Therefore, Mrs Birling is portrayed as aloof through her meticulously maintained facade and indifferent language, further separating her from the other, more emotional characters. To summarise, in today's lesson, we explored the character of Mrs Birling from An Inspector Calls, focusing on her aloof attitude. We examined how her reliance on etiquette and decorum creates a facade of superiority, revealing her as distant and unfeeling. Her repeated contempt for the lower class, as shown in her dismissive remarks about Eva Smith, highlights her lack of empathy. Additionally, we saw how Mrs Birling uses social etiquette to present herself as superior, prioritizing her own feelings over justice for Eva. Lastly, her controlled and inauthentic emotional responses contrast with the genuine tension felt by other characters, further emphasizing her detachment. Through these examples, we understand how Mrs Birling's aloofness and self-imposed superiority affect her interactions and decisions, making her a key figure in Priestley's critique of social attitudes. See you next time! Watch the rest of the GCSE English Literature course at Sophos Education.